Hello everyone and welcome to a mixtape review, and in this video I'm going to review Caprisongs by FKA Twigs. So this is the new project and mixtape of FKA Twigs, which shows her going into a bit of a different direction compared to her previous works, while still having some of the elements that have made her sound quite intriguing over the years. For me, she made a really exceptional start with her debut album, which I would say was one of the most refreshing directions I've seen on an R&B album. This is an album that I've enjoyed a lot, and I think that it still manages to hold up pretty well up to this day. However, I had a pretty hot take considering Magdalene, the very next album, to be a huge disappointment. For me, this was an album that I didn't care for at all. And it's not like it didn't have its moments or that I couldn't really get the artistic directions that this one was going in particular, or that how significant it was with its lyrical themes. However, I couldn't get into the music whatsoever. I thought that this was an album that felt really boring for me. I didn't really know what to expect out of this new album, but it seems that it tries to go a bit away from just creating a really artistic and exceptional album, and rather than just creating something where she has fun with it. And honestly, I was kinda actually looking forward to it. I was intrigued to listen to a fun album out of FKA Twigs and see how this would end up going. My skepticism though to this regard is that this album might not be possibly a project that she would end up taking seriously, considering that it's just a mixtape. So I don't know, maybe I just thought in this one that maybe she will not try as hard, which is not particularly bad obviously. I think I was just expecting something different after Magdalene, but I still got into this mixtape having some expectations, and I obviously could understand why some people might have some mixed thoughts about this thing, because those who really loved Magdalene might end up feeling a bit of a disconnect with this particular album, as it would end up going into some more standard directions of like pop and rap music. I ended up kind of looking forward to it, although I didn't really like the fact that this is 17 tracks, and with some of them being interludes. I think that this is a lot of tracks. I was kinda intrigued though listening to the single Tears in the Club featuring The Weeknd. Honestly, this is a pretty solid track, and even if it contains some elements of pop music and R&B that are pretty familiar, standard and basic, I think that the track has a pretty interesting sound and some of the elements that has made the sound of FKA Twigs to be appealing for all of this time. So I ended up finding the directions and the aesthetics of this track to be kinda enjoyable, and I was obviously looking forward to more like this. So getting into this mixtape, I think that Caprisongs is a bit of a mess, as it doesn't really know whether it wants to be an album that would just focus on simple, catchy and fun melodies, or if it wants to be more than just that, with inclusions of experimental and weird approaches, which is something that I'm all for if it's done correctly, which is what I feel it's the case with the very first FKA Twigs album. I think that it made a really nice combination of some really catchy pop and R&B elements, but with aesthetics and sounds that are not the norm, and in my opinion made for some really fascinating results, and something that I haven't really listened in many occasions done in such a good way. On the other hand, Magdalene, in my opinion, suffered from this thing, as I felt a bit of a disconnection from some of the directions the album wanted to go, and I have a bit of the same issue with Caprisongs. I think that the album benefits the most when it keeps most things simple and having a nice balance between the directions that it wants to go, with some really simplistic and fun beats, while also having a few beats or bass sounds that might be a bit more aggressive or distorted, which in some of those occasions it might make for some really nice moments. But there are other occasions where the sounds might feel a bit all over the place, or just an attempt for something experimental when it doesn't need to, or especially with some of the directions of the vocals, which can be all over the place, and in my opinion they don't always work nicely. There are a few occasions where she takes some risks with the vocals, whether it comes to the manipulation or the range or some rapping segments, which in my opinion they don't really sound all that good, especially with the context of some of the songs. And there are other occasions where the album seems to go into a few more serious directions, with a few more moody tracks that would go closer to directions of like Magdalene, which would end up feeling a bit lackluster and somewhat boring. The album also has a few interludes and actually segments out of the songs that would be like introductions or outros with many different samples of like dialogues and other sort of like sound effects compiled at these moments, which actually end up not really being that bad or unnecessary. They fit somewhat nicely for the most part with the majority of the tracks and where they are placed, and also I would say that it contains some of the most most sonically intriguing elements in some of those occasions. However, it's still a somewhat big portion of the album, which ends up becoming a bit boring, and I would prefer it if it was cut a bit shorter. Now, when it comes to some of the tracks, if you count out the very lengthy introduction of the very first track, I actually ended up really enjoying Ride the Dragon. I think it's one of the coolest moments over here, and it gave me this fun vibe that I was looking forward out of this album. Now, the track Honda ends up going into a different direction, which I didn't really expect that much from FKA Twigs, and we actually see it happening much more in this project. And I wouldn't really say that I like those directions as it goes into those more Latin pop approaches, which for the most part it's not like there's something more going on to them. They end up sounding really basic. I think that Honda is one of those tracks that I like some of the slightly aggressive elements and with a bit of a haunting atmosphere in the background, but the overall delivery is not really my thing. Meta Angel ended up being one of the most experimental and intriguing moments out of this whole project. I ended up really liking some of the directions this track took. There are a few moments where, in my opinion, when it comes to some vocal portions, it didn't really work that nicely, but I still think that it's one of the most unique moments out of this whole project. Like I said, Tears at the Club is a really nice track, actually maybe my favorite out of the album, which is a bit disappointing as I didn't really say I found other moments that had the catchiness or the energy of Tears in the Club. However, I ended up liking the kinda smooth direction of the track Oh My Love. It's a bit simplistic and it's kinda cool. I think it's done in a nice way, and it's nice that this particular track keeps it simple. Now, after this point, I ended up not really caring about this album as much. We have the track Pamplemouse, which could have been one of the coolest and most unique ideas out of the album, but it's treated as an interlude, and it's just cut really short. And then this leads to Caprisongs Interlude, which is only 25 seconds, and it feels really pointless. After this point, we get Lightbeamers, which is one of the more smooth and soothing tracks out of the album, which in my opinion ends up just being really boring and not really having some of the best vocal deliveries out of the album. The track Puppy Bones was the one I was looking forward to due to the feature of Ceasar, which I think has done some really cool tracks, and this is not the direction I expected out of this song. And I can't really say I even saw the contribution of Ceasar out of this song. This is another sort of Latin pop track which actually goes kinda hard. It's a bit energetic, but it's not my style, and I didn't really like some of the vocal deliveries. I still kinda admire some of the sounds on this one, which is another track that in my opinion feels like lost potential. It has a kinda interesting introduction, I like where this was going, but the beat and the vocals ended up feeling a bit weak, and it's a really short track as well. It contains some of the most intriguing and experimental ideas, but it's just cut short once again. And then after this point I think we get some really lackluster moments with tracks like Jealousy, which feels like a really basic and average Latin pop song, which I couldn't really find something to like about this one in particular. I thought that it was not really that much of a cool song. Then we get Careless, which is another one of those tracks that feels like a snooze fest. It's really boring. I don't really like the smooth directions. Then Ceasar doesn't sound good on this track. And then we also have a few similar approaches with Minds of Men. This track kinda has its memorability with a chorus, but apart from that, it feels really forgettable. Then we get track Girl Interlude, which in my opinion, it's kinda lengthy for an interlude and it doesn't really have that much to it. Darjeeling ended up being one of the best and most unique moments out of the album, as we see FKA Twigs going into drill with his track, which I didn't really expect this, and I think that it's done nicely. Even if the instrumental and the beat is kinda basic for drill standards, I still liked some of the background elements with the sounds and the samples. I think that this one was done in a nice way, and it sounds quite nice. The final track, Thank You Song, feels like those more chill sentimental moments that we saw in some occasions in the album, and I think that it's more of the same. I think that this one has a few okay moments, but for the most part I didn't really care for it. I thought that it was a bit lackluster, kinda minimal and not really in the good way. I think that this is the one track that I would say goes kinda the closest with some of the directions out of Magdalene. I still don't really think that it was done in that much of a nice way. So for the most part we get a mixtape over here that I think could have been better better in some occasions. I ended up liking some of its aspects, but never to the point where I would say that I ended up feeling blown away by any of it or feeling really impressed. This ends up feeling like another disappointing FKA Twigs project for me, and the more I listened to it, the less intrigued I ended up being by it. There is nothing really special about this mixtape, other than the fact that FKA Twigs took a few risks and went into a few different directions with your sound. It is nice to see what it feels like FKA Twigs having more fun with the projects that she makes. The few elements and aesthetics that have made the sound of FKA Twigs appealing and such a promising artist is the only thing that basically keeps the foundation and makes Caprisongs sound actually a bit decent, because the rest of the experience sounds really basic and unimaginative. So yeah, for me, this ends up feeling like another sort of mediocre project from FKA Twigs. I'm gonna give Caprisongs a 5+ out of 10. What's your opinion on this mixtape? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. If you like, if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.